infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published updated recommendations from its Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices for the Japanese encephalitis vaccine, or the JE vaccine, a couple of weeks ago. So joining me today to discuss Japanese encephalitis, the vaccines, travel, and the updated recommendations is Dr. Susan Hills. Dr. Hills is with the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases with the CDC. Dr. Hills, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Robert.
You bet. So before we get into the new recommendations, Dr. Hills, can you give the audience a primer on what is Japanese encephalitis and where is it found?
So, Japanese encephalitis is a virus that's spread by mosquitoes, and it occurs throughout most of Asia and parts of the Western Pacific, from as far west as Pakistan, then throughout Asia, and then as far south as some of the northernmost islands off the tip of Australia. It's part of a family of viruses called flaviviridae, and so in the United States, a similar virus that people will be familiar with that's part of that same family is West Nile virus.
Sure. So it's a disease primarily of Asia. Dr. Hills, can you talk about its relationship with pigs? Because when we hear about somebody getting Japanese encephalitis, one thing they always look at is were they near pigs or hogs?
So the virus circulates in what we call an enzootic transmission cycle, which basically just means the virus circulates in the environment between mosquitoes and certain animals. For JE virus, pigs are the main animal that are part of that cycle, along with certain birds. And so the virus is typically circulating on an ongoing basis between pigs or birds and mosquitoes. Humans aren't typically part of that cycle, but they can incidentally get infected when they're bitten by an infected mosquito, and that's when JE disease can occur in humans.
Yeah, and just to be specific about the mosquito, it's not the Aedes mosquito like we see with dengue and chikungunya. It's a Culex mosquito, am I correct?
That's right, yeah. It's Culex mosquitoes that spread JE virus, typically Culex triteniorhynchus in Asia. And they are a mosquito that breeds in pools of water. The very characteristic place that they breed in Asia is in flooded rice fields.
Yeah. Now, this is a pretty serious pathogen. Am I right?
That's right. That's right, yes. When someone's infected, fortunately, only about 1% of the time will they develop encephalitis. But when encephalitis occurs, it can be very severe in terms of its outcomes. So overall, about 20 to 30% of people will die, and then about 30 to 50% of the survivors will be left with some sort of disability. And that can range from something like memory problems through to really severe outcomes like being left to have to be ventilated for the rest of their life.
Yeah. Is there any specific treatment for Japanese encephalitis, or is it basically supportive therapy?
There's no medication that can specifically treat the JE virus infection. When somebody becomes sick with JE, they are generally admitted to hospital and they will be given supportive care. But unfortunately, there's no specific treatment that can actually target the virus. So, of course, that's why prevention of the infection in the first place is important.
Absolutely, and that really leads me into my next set of questions. Can you talk about the available vaccines for the prevention of Japanese encephalitis?
So there are many different types of JE vaccines, and in fact they've been available in Asia for decades and for several many years in the US as well. And they include the vaccines that are available include inactivated and live vaccines. Many have actually been produced locally in Asia, which is of course where the greatest burden of disease is and where many countries have introduced local vaccination programs for the whole of their populations. The vaccine that we have in the United States is produced by an Austrian company called Valneva. Its trade name is Ixiaro, and it's an inactivated vero cell culture-derived vaccine, and all that refers to is the type of cells that the vaccine virus is grown on.
Mm-hmm. Now, Japanese encephalitis, since it's primarily found in Asia, is a possible concern for travelers from, say, the U.S. or from Europe. What kind of travel pattern in Asia would be considered risky for JE if you're traveling in Asia?
Yeah, there are a variety of factors that increase risk, and they essentially relate to the presence of the mosquitoes that are going to spread JE virus to a person. One of the main factors is just travelling for longer periods, so there's more opportunity for exposure to the mosquitoes. Travelling during the JE virus transmission season, and that can vary from country to country depending on weather and temperature and rice planting and other factors. Spending time in rural areas and participating in outdoor activities, again, because the mosquitoes that spread JE are typically found in rural areas, and they typically do bite outdoors rather than indoors. But finally then, because they are a mosquito that bites from dusk to dawn, staying in accommodation where there is no air conditioning or screens or bed nets is also a risk factor because of the risk of being bitten during that overnight period.
Yeah. Now, the MMWR that was put out recently by the CDC described the new JE vaccine recommendations. Can you go over those new recommendations with the audience, please?
Sure. And I think before getting to the specific recommendations, the first important point is that in determining whether a traveller should be vaccinated, it really requires a conversation between the healthcare provider and the traveller to understand the traveller's risk for infection based on their planned itinerary and those risk factors that we just discussed.
Sure.
Then, of course, it's considering also whether they might be travelling to Asia again in future, their understanding of how serious JE can be and that there is no treatment, and the fact that there is a very safe and very effective vaccine available, but no vaccine is free of the risk of side effects. So it's considering all those pieces, and importantly, whether or not the decision's made to vaccinate, the traveller should be advised to take precautions to prevent mosquito bites. In terms of the specific recommendations that were made by the US Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, JE vaccine is recommended for people who are moving to a JE endemic country to live, or longer-term travellers to JE endemic countries. So, for example, a month or longer, it would be recommended, and also frequent travellers to JE endemic countries because, of course, for the repeated exposure risk. JE vaccine also should be considered for shorter-term travellers if they have an increased risk for JE based on their planned duration of travel, when and where they might be travelling, for example, what activities they'll be doing, and what type of accommodation they'll be sleeping in while they are overseas. And it should also be considered for travellers who are uncertain of how long and where they might be going. Finally, it isn't recommended for travellers who have very low-risk itineraries. And, for example, if they're only going for a short period and only to urban areas, or if they're not travelling during the JE virus transmission season, then in situations like that, the vaccine wouldn't be recommended.
Okay. Is the JE vaccine safe and efficacious for, say, children and pregnant women?
So the vaccine is licensed from 2 months of age, so it can be used in children, for children 2 months of age through 35 months of age. It's actually a smaller dose than is given to older children and adults, but it is licensed down to 2 months of age. In terms of pregnant women, there have been no studies on the vaccine's use in pregnant women. And for that reason, pregnancy is considered a precaution for use of the vaccine. However, because the disease is so severe, if pregnant women have to travel to an area where there is a high risk of JE, then they should be vaccinated if the benefits are going to outweigh the theoretical risks of vaccination to the mother or their developing fetus.
Sure. Okay, great. Any final thoughts on JE, the vaccine, or anything else, Dr. Hills?
So the newly published recommendations, as you mentioned, they are freely available online, and I hope they will be a helpful resource to particularly practitioners who are seeing travellers planning to travel overseas. JE is a rare disease, and so it's not one that many people and practitioners might be familiar with. So the recommendations have aimed to provide resources that can be helpful to help with those discussions with travellers. So there is links to information like the Yellow Book, the CDC Health Information for International Travel book, and that provides specific information on when the JE virus transmission season is in each JE endemic country. There's a table that specifically describes the risks of JE to help with discussions with travellers. And there's also a flowchart, for example, to help walk through the various consideration steps in terms of the decision on vaccination. And I guess finally, what we shouldn't forget is that while this document's purpose is to provide information and recommendations on vaccination for US travellers, it's important to remember that the virus is an important problem for populations living in JE endemic countries. In fact, it's the leading cause of vaccine-preventable encephalitis in Asia. So it really is, important to remember that while control of disease in travellers is important, controlling the disease for the local population in Asia is also an extremely important priority for global health.
All right, very good. And for listeners, if you want to take a look at the MMWR report, I will go ahead and link to it in the show notes page when I publish the podcast. And I want to thank you, Dr. Susan Hills, for sharing your time and your expertise on this topic. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Robert.